The Byte Show is listener-supported at thebyteshow.com.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Byte Show. And I'd like the audience to welcome Peter Baxster. He is going to talk about the Jubilee cycles and the Kondratieff Wave. And Peter, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, sure. And GeorgeAnn, first I want to thank you for having me on. I think this Jubilee topic and the Kondratieff Wave is a very relevant topic at this point, given all that's going on in the world.
Yeah.
So I do thank you for discussing this. My background is that I've been in the securities business for over 30 years. I've been a broker, an investment banker. For the last 10 years, I've been a consultant helping Canadian gold mining companies get listed in the U.S. And during my college years in the early 80s, I learned about the Kondratieff concept in the high-level economics courses. And that the Kondratieff Wave really intrigued me then. And it kind of nudged at me in my post-college years. And in about 10 years ago, it really started to intrigue me to the point where I started Googling it and learning a lot more about it. And I felt so compelled that in 2007 I set up a website dedicated to the discussion of long-wave cycles, in particular the Kondratieff Wave. And I named it KondratieffWinter.com because the Kondratieff Winter era is the one that we're in right now and is the most dramatic. And so I have become very open about discussing the Kondratieff cycle since 2007 on my website, and that's why we're discussing it today.
Okay. Well, for an example, we know that Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, was involved in debt cancellation even back in 1792 BC.
Mm-hmm.
And he did 4 cancellations of debt. How come they don't wise up and do that today, Peter?
Well, the Jubilee concept has been ignored, much like the Kondratieff Wave concept. Both of these are far-flung theories that have been that seem to many people outdated or irrelevant, and yet they're more relevant than ever before.
Oh, yes.
Now, I think what I remember, the Hammurabi Code was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and I guess they believed in instant justice there. The code of justice for the ancient Hebrews and the Israelites with regard to the Jubilee cycle. So let's talk about what their approach was.
Okay.
The Jubilee period was the longest time cycle in the economy of ancient Israel. And this Jubilee concept was a form of socioeconomic engineering designed to prevent poverty and the establishment of large monopolies. And this Jubilee concept corresponds to the natural long-wave economic cycle. And these ancient Hebrews understood that there was, in fact, a long-wave cycle. And it was important not to have people enslaved in debt.
Mm-hmm.
And the purpose of the Jubilee, plain and simple, was a preventative measure against depressions. If they're observed, then there are no depressions. Unfortunately, they were observed in ancient times, and the Hebrews did just wonderfully with this system they had. Their system was a sabbatical every 7 years where individual debts would be forgiven. And after 50 years, or actually 49 years, in the 50th year, they would have land revert back to the owner so that there would be no monopoly.
Yeah.
So that was the basic concept there. And, what they were thinking is that the Jubilee cycle limits debt growth by these sabbatical years, every 7 years. And each sabbatical year, when debt is forgiven, it prevents debt from getting out of hand and thus destroying the economy. It makes creditors wiser. Creditors will not grant a business loan unless it's a clear profit opportunity. So you don't get situations where you have open-ended debt going beyond a natural sub-cycle of 7 years or a longer cycle of 49 or 50 years. And what we've seen today is these concepts being ignored, and now we have debt in the several tens of trillions worldwide, which is maybe 7 to 8 standard deviations above what it was even in the 1930s. And I don't think very many people can understand just how significant the debt levels are right now. So it has definitely been forgotten.
Well, they're in the trillions.
Yeah.
People like Jamie Dimon and people like that, they're more interested in getting control of money and debt. I don't think that the current lot of bankers would be agreeable to debt forgiveness.
Well, of course not. And that's why what will happen in this next coming years is that there will be an absolute destruction of debt, destruction of wealth through default. Now, we actually had it happen in 2008, and these banks would have been down for the count if it was not for the gifts of our own government. So you have to remember, they actually did go bankrupt. Goldman Sachs, all the smart guys in the room, they actually did go bankrupt. If they weren't bailed out, we would have had our new system and we would have had our rebooted worldwide economy if the U.S. government did not step in and do what they did. But unfortunately, they stepped in, enabled the banks to continue these practices, and now we have a situation where we've incurred maybe $15 to $20 trillion of debt between the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve and the banking system. So we're more in debt now than we were in 2008, and that's sad.
Well, yeah. A lot of innocent investors lost everything, and I think it was Jamie Dimon that was testifying before the Senate that he didn't know where all these trillions of dollars went. He said they just evaporated.
Yeah. Well, there are several hundreds of trillions in derivative contracts that are off of the books and not regulated. So the truth is that there's no one person other than God that knows where the real liabilities are in the current banking system. And that's why, you have to wonder what will happen if there's an extreme shock one day. We nearly had it in 2008, and the 2008 crash was more of a liquidity crisis brought on by a housing debt bubble. The current crisis that we're in right now that is evolving in Europe, and it's really global, is more of a not a liquidity crisis, but a solvency crisis. And that's much different because it's a much bigger problem, and it really can't be bailed out. So we're at the end of a long super cycle in credit that is defined as the Kondratieff cycle, and we're at the very end of it, but very few people understand and look at these crises in terms of the long wave theory. So,
well, what is that theory?
Well, the Kondratieff theory is actually very simple. It proposes that there are natural long waves of economic activity that have been going on for a long time, since the beginning of man, and that in the modern era, beginning in the Industrial Revolution period of the mid-1700s, you could divide each of these long wave cycles of roughly 54 to 60 years into 4 distinct seasons of maybe 15 to 17 years. And in these seasons, you have a very specific set of traits that is going on in the economy. There's with regard to interest rates, with regard to growth, with regard to inflation, with regard to what particular asset classes are performing well. And the truth is that since the mid-1700s, we have gone through 4 complete cycles, and this 4th Kondratieff cycle will end in 2016, 2017. And each of these cycles have had 4 seasons that have had identical periods of 15, 16 years where the traits in each cycle have been identical. You've had the bull markets always occur in the fall season. You've had the bear markets always occur in the winter season. And the amount of correlation going back individually and minutely between all of these cycles is really staggering. And that's why it's kind of amazing that people have not picked up on just how accurate this cycle really is.
Oh, boy. Well, they even use those cycles for war.
Well, there's a natural correlation between the wars coming in near the end of the Kondratieff Winter period. Like, for example, in the last Kondratieff Winter period, World War II, we had the Kondratieff Winter. The Civil War was in the Kondratieff Winter period in the 1800s. So there's another correlation there where you have social mood being down because of what's going on in the overall economy, and it leads to conflict. And then you have autumn periods where things are going well, like the 90s, and then you have great periods of prosperity. So there's a great correlation between these periods over time, and it's so acute that it really cannot be so easily dismissed.
Well, I wouldn't think it could be. And don't the bankers understand these things?
Well, no, they don't. Actually, what I call the flat earth crowd, which is financial mainstream media, financial press, and, of course, what I call the materialists that pretty much run the world, which is the bankers and the corporations. They don't believe in the natural laws. They believe in, they don't understand the higher truths that are out there. And, for example, that there is no real problem with resources. They don't understand some of the concepts in the Bible about prosperity. That prosperity is abundant, actually infinite. There are just certain concepts that they don't understand. They believe in limited resources, and they have a very poorly defined understanding of the worldview as respect to the universal laws. They do not understand the universal laws. And that's why they believe that they have to enslave everyone with debt and maintain their power, when the irony is that if they live by these other rules, everyone could prosper, and then they could prosper more too.
Wow. That's all I can say is wow. What are we looking at this year?
Well, here's how the Kondratieff Wave, the current Kondratieff Wave, is playing out right now, as I see it. Now, this is partially objective, partially subjective. The Kondratieff cycle that we're in right now began in 1949 after the majority of the GDP, of the debt of the World War II was extinguished, and we were back to normal GDP to debt levels in 1949. And the stock market was at 140 then, believe it or not. And we have a cycle of 15 years that goes to, or 16 years that goes to the beginning of 1966. That's the spring phase. Then we have in 66 the inflation phase of the summer season period. And that was the Vietnam War brought on inflation, and this is where our deficits came in. In 1971, we ran out of money, went bankrupt, and closed the gold window, and basically began a fiat currency system where we used dollar hegemony and the printing of U.S. dollars and flooding worldwide dollars to create inflation. And, of course, that peaked in the 70s where you had gold going from 35 an ounce in 71 to $850 in 1980. Now, another pivot happened, a very, very important pivot happened in 1982, where you have the pivot from the summer to the fall phase. And this is where the inversion from hard assets to paper assets came about. And you wanted to be out of hard assets then and into paper assets, because the fall period beginning in 82 began the biggest bull market in history. The Dow was at 777, and it went to, as we all know, at the end of the fall, 15,000. So the fall period technically ended in the year 2000. The year 2000 was a year that marked peak social positive mood, and we'd gone without wars for many years. We had the internet bubble. It looked like the next century was just going to be the greatest. And then we had a big turning point in 2000 and 2001, and we had the internet bubble crash, and then 9/11, and this period began the winter period. And the winter period, beginning from 2000 until 2016, believe it or not, even though we've had great rallies in the markets at some points during this decade, Inflation adjusted, the NASDAQ is down, I think, 80% since the beginning of winter, and the S&P would be down maybe 35 to 40% inflation adjusted. So many don't realize that's why they call it the lost decade in stocks. They nominally look better, but the dollar's been crushed, and inflation adjusted, when you combine inflation and the dollar's weakness through all the printing, the purchasing power has been materially degraded, and this is why the middle class is getting affected so badly, and none of us feel very rich. Well, that's because we've been in the economic winter for longer than we think. So I believe the winter will be playing out, and then we're now in what I call the eighth inning of the fourth quarter, which means that the next 3 years are going to be probably the most dramatic in our lifetimes with regard to the financial markets. And I believe that we're going to have a serious market crash that is right in line with what the Kondratieff Winter theory expects. But the last 3 years of this winter will be the most, because they have pushed out the pain of this. As we all know with the printing, this is what they did differently this time than the 1930s. So the next 3 years, you're probably likely to see more of a compression of asset prices than you had in the 30s, where it was more of a slow bleed down. And I think that at its peak in 2015, 2016, you could see the market go as low as 4,000 on the Dow if we're at the end of a grand supercycle. And if it's a millennial supercycle, it could go to as low as just under 1,000.
Oh my goodness. Well, do you think that that they might devalue the dollar?
Well, they've been trying all they can, but the irony is, what's lost on most people is that as much as they try to print, we're the reserve currency, and the irony is that even after the S&P downgrade last year, our dollar is up significantly higher, and that's because we're the best house in the worst neighborhood, and even there's a rush to debasement among all major currencies, but yet we have two advantages. We have three advantages. We have the biggest economy in the world. We have the biggest and most liquid government securities market in the world, and we have the dollar as a reserve currency. Those three things team up to allow us to have a really nice cushion against the rest of the world, and that explains very clearly why our markets are actually up this year when most all of the other markets are down very much. China is actually down now 60% from its high in 2007, and we're eclipsing our highs of 2007. So this tells you that foreign capital is flying into the U.S. because it's a perceived safe haven. And but of course, I think that's a sucker's bet, though.
That's only a perception.
Well, the perception is reality, because if you own stocks, you've done well over the last couple of years. But I do believe that it's providing the biggest bubble in stocks, because you can't have a situation where nearly every country in the world is crashing and one country is doing well. It just it doesn't stand the smell test, and I think from your intuition, it just tells you that it just can't last. The rest of the world is really feeling the brunt of the Kondratieff Winter, much, much more than the U.S. And because we're a globalized economy, you just cannot have a situation sustain like this for very much longer. I don't believe.
Well, good Lord, people are actually committing suicide and setting themselves on fire and hanging themselves and abandoning their children in the streets because they can't feed them.
But here's something I want to make a very important point.
Okay.
That to be optimistic about all this, because there's three important things to remember. Number one, we're 12 years into this cycle, so we've only got a few years left of the winter, and that's actually a very reassuring thing.
About how many years?
2015 to 2016 to 2017 will be the bottom of this cycle. The worst of it will hit then.
Okay.
So I don't believe that we're going to have when the crash really hits, it will not be like 1929 or 1933, where we have another decade and a half left of attrition and pain. So the way it's unfolding, this winter is unfolding completely different than the 29 to 33 crash, because that was the worst over at the beginning. Here, what they've done is they've used the alchemy of finance to delay the worst of it, but when it does happen, the period of time for the winter we've already had more pain than we realized in the last several years, so we will not have a sustained long period of a depression once this thing does crash, unlike the 30s, where we had the crash first and then the depression just linger on for years. We're much farther into this now than people realize. So the thing that's good to know is that, and we also have the ability with technology and communication to be able to reboot ourselves much, much better. We're much more able now to resuscitate ourselves. So for people that come to my site expecting doomsday, I say that, well, we're going to have a period of entrenchment that's going to be very painful, but the good news is it's only going to be a couple of years, although it will be pretty brutal, but then we will have an era that the next Kondratieff spring is just around the corner.
Wow.
And this spring period will offer great innovations. Energy prices will be going down. We're going to have alternative energy. We're going to have nanotechnology. They're mapping the human genome. There's going to be just tremendous gains in technology that are going to benefit all of us. And that is the beauty of the Kondratieff cycle. It's an upwardly sloping model of prosperity. If you look at how it began in the 1700s and the wealth that's been created, there's less and less people in poverty. And every time you have a new change of a new cycle, from the winter to the spring, you have a very big upsurge in overall prosperity. Now, we saw this at the beginning of the last cycle. In 1949, at the end of that cycle, we had everyone in the world going through not only depression, but then a global world war. But after that, we had just a tremendous period. You could call the glory days between the late 40s and the mid-60s of growth and just a revamping of society that made all of our lives better. So that period is just around the corner for us. And so that's why I'm urge people to not be so upset or let things get the worst of you. Given even with the headlines that are going on, as bad as they are, you have to remember and be grounded and understand that through the long wave lens that we're in just the final stages of it, and we have to hunker down for these next few years, but it will get much better, much quicker than we think, I believe.
Well, would it behoove people to purchase gold and silver?
Well, that's it's funny because I'm in that business actually. I've been advocating it for maybe 6 or 7 years since.
I didn't know that.
Well, I'm in my professional job now is to take, because I saw this coming on years ago as an advocate of the cycle. So in 2005, I said, okay, I see gold moving up. I'm going to move into the gold sector for the first time, and I've worked in helping Canadian mining companies get public in the U.S. And I've helped almost 100 of them get listed here in the U.S. in the last 7 years. So I advocated it very strongly. However, right now, I believe that gold is going to do very well in the next couple of years, but I don't advocate it as a long-term hold because it has gone up so much, so fast, that I believe that there are other assets out there that are better to own, like natural gas. Just from the standpoint of price appreciation, I think gold is a little risky here because theoretically when this Kondratieff winter really hits full boat, then you're going to see all asset prices go down. People will be selling their winners, and gold has been a winner. So I'm a little bit hesitant to just dive in to buy gold right here.
Well, it would seem that to store up food would be a good...
Well, actually, that's another thing. The two assets that you want to own now are agricultural commodities and something like natural gas and energy that has gone from $14 down to $2.80.
Yeah.
So those are the two things I like. Agricultural commodities, we have a serious problem with drought and weather. There's only 7 breadbaskets in the world. There's 7 billion people growing exponentially, and there's a challenge in feeding the world. So
yes.
That's one of the few assets that I would advocate considering to own.
Wow. Well, with the Jubilee cycle, will all of this just explode and go into a Jubilee cycle?
Well, let's revisit the Jubilee concept.
Okay.
And how it ties into the Kondratieff Wave. Okay. Basically, the scripture called for regulated capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, borrowing levels, debt levels, and having corporations get out of control, or entities, even in the ancient times, that had controlling interest. And the scripture knew that to prevent this. So it's important to prevent any kind of entity that can extend its reach over a normal cycle period. It's okay to have reach, but not excessive reach, okay?
Right.
And what I see with the Kondratieff Wave, Kondratieff Wave is nature's way of giving us a spanking if we don't honor the Jubilee cycle, because it will do it for us. Mother Nature will do the work for us. If we don't have the understanding of how to coordinate these global debts and the system itself from ever getting to the point that it is,
mm-hmm.
then the Kondratieff Wave comes along because these things cannot be sustained.
Right.
So these are two natural concepts. One, like the Hebrews understood that it's a social engineering, it's a form of socioeconomic engineering, and the idea is to prevent it. Now, the purpose that I have in making more and more people understand about the Kondratieff Wave is really twofold. I want individuals to understand it so they can know where we are in the cycle, to help them see what the future could bring, where we are in the cycle, and also for them to help them manage their investments better. But actually, more important than that, it's more important for our leaders to understand these cycles, these long-wave cycles, the way that the Israelites did. Because if they did, they would understand that at certain points in the cycle, you want to pull back and refrain from building, refrain from building excess capacity and incurring too much debt. And if the modern world understood these concepts, you wouldn't have the explosion of debt that's going on right now. And so what they've done basically is at the first sign of any kind of recession, they just print more.
Yeah.
And we have increased the debt loads geometrically squared since really the mid-'80s. And this is just, it's basically daring nature to give it a spanking. And it will happen. It will happen.
Oh, my gosh. Well, oh, boy.
If history, I'm just going by history. I was
Yes.
interviewed on RT.com recently
Mm-hmm.
because they had another guest on before me a couple of days earlier talking about a form of creditism that would basically be this taking over capitalism. And its basic theory is that they will just print and print until forever. And the balances will go to astronomical levels, and they'll just get bigger every year. And looking back, we're looking ahead maybe 400 years from now. I guess according to them, they would be 55 million quadrillion. It just doesn't work like that. We all know that things are getting to levels now that just cannot be sustained. As a matter of fact, quadrillion is now going to be entering into the lexicon of people, and you're going to see this word being used because trillions is such a big number. But now we're talking about the amount of global derivatives now are approaching 1 quadrillion. So the only way we're going to be able to actually properly discuss the sum total of some of these assets is start to referring them to the next level, which is quadrillion, and we can't even wrap our minds around billions, much less trillions, and take about 1,000 trillion and you got a quadrillion. We're already there right now.
Oh my gosh. Oh. Well, with our economy, they keep pouring more money into weapons and the Pentagon and war, and we've got over 1,000 bases military bases scattered around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, they talk about cutting food stamps, cutting Social Security, cutting off the safety net for people.
Right.
How is that going to work out?
Well, we are about to witness the biggest clash in history between two opposing forces, and the two clashes will be November 6th, the election, between two forces that have radically different ideas on how to change Washington. The only thing they agree on is that the debt is too high.
Yeah.
And then the one 5 minutes after the election that will begin, that will go on for 6 weeks, will be the reconciliation between the Bush tax cuts and all of the so-called fiscal cliff that's going to hit us at the end of the year. So all of these things are going to be confronting us in this amazing period beginning in November and December of this year. And so this is going to be front and center for everyone to see. And, of course, both sides are, I believe, wrong. I think that the Democrats have to make some more concessions on entitlement reform, and the Republicans are really way off base in not believing that there should be some tax increases for the rich. Because when you look at it, inflation, if you look at the total percent of taxes that corporations and U.S. individuals pay, it is at the lowest percent of GDP that it's ever been in history. And we have to remember that in the 1950s and 60s, we had the highest marginal tax rate was 90% in the 50s, and it was, I think, as high as 70-some-odd% in the 70s. And we had some fantastic growth periods of 3 to 5% growth during those periods. So the argument that higher taxes cripple an economy is just wrong, and I believe that the trickle-down economics theories by the Republicans has been proven wrong. But tax policy is really not the answer, because it's only a component. The total amount of money that we could be bringing in on what I would call a reasonable tax increase is very, very tiny compared to the overall debt.
Yeah.
A much bigger problem right now and a much bigger challenge is what I call a master grand reconciliation of a coordinated debt jubilee. And this is what has to happen. We have to have winners and losers. We have to have bondholders get whacked much more than they have been. And I think you're going to see situations like what happened in Greece over the summer, where their bondholders took a big haircut. Now, that was one of the first examples we've seen in the modern era of the Jubilee, where bondholders, even though Greece shouldn't have run up those debts, the bondholders were foolish, and they should pay, because otherwise then you have the entire Greek taxpayer base. The Greek population will pay the difference, and that's not right.
Right.
Because only a few people made those bad decisions at the top, but they're going to enslave the entire Greek people. So this is the basic dilemma that we have right now going on with the global debt picture, is that we have a few people at the top making decisions that influence all of the taxpayers and basically the populations of these countries. And what we have to do is, what's more important than tax policy or cutting Medicaid or Social Security, is having a great open debate and discussion, a discourse on a coordinated global debt jubilee. And that's what I'm proposing, and that's what I'm advocating, and that's going to be an area that I am going to be working on to adding material on my site.
Good.
About solutions. I do right now, just so you know, for your viewers, if you want to read more on the Jubilee on my website at KondratieffWinter.com, you can go to the Kondratieff Spring tab, and I have a Jubilee section there that has a lot of material. Most of it is by a guy named Daniel Gregg, who's a biblical scholar who has done the greatest work of anyone I've ever seen in linking the biblical Jubilee to the modern Kondratieff era. He basically traces out every single long wave period, going back from several thousand BC to the present.
Wow.
And in 3 specific articles that I have on the site, the economy of the Jubilee, which is a primer, and then we have his masterpiece, The second one is Jubilee 2012 Real Solutions. And the third one is, will the Kondratieff cycle revert to the Jubilee average? And that is a fascinating topic. This man is very well schooled in the Kondratieff cycle, but he's even more, he's one of the top biblical scholars in the world. And he has spent the majority of his work focusing on the economics of what's in the Bible. And I would argue he's probably the best in the world at that.
You also mentioned David Knox Barker.
Yes.
His book. Tell us about that.
Okay, well, David Knox Barker is the gentleman that I consider to be the world's expert on the Kondratieff Wave theory. He's written several books, and he has a website called longwavedynamics.com that can be accessed at my website. And I have some material in the Jubilee section and in other places on his material. And he has written he has got some tremendous insight, and he also offers probably the most complete solutions to how we can get out of this mess in the coming years. So I would definitely advocate for your viewers to look into his website, which is longwavedynamics.com, and also Mr. Daniel Gregg's is torahtimes.org.
Okay. Peter, is it possible that one of these mornings we'll wake up and go to the bank and it will be closed?
I don't think, well, that's, that is a big unknown. I mean, how this will all go down will be dependent on how quick we can react to this, because I do think that we're going to hit a tipping point at some point where the global financial system, it could be in peril. And it's very difficult to say what will happen at that point, because we could be facing a new paradigm in how we relate to money, currency, exchange of goods, and how the banking system will operate. I am not advocating at all to pull money out of banks. I believe that I have enough confidence that they'll be able to take the right steps to be able to prevent the bank runs, because they know that that's the most important thing out there. I do think that the thing that is more likely to suffer is just general economic activity through the basis of this massive deleveraging that could all come about in a very accelerated period. But I don't think that that the banking system is in peril, because I believe that the Federal Reserve will pump whatever liquidity, and they'll do what they did in 2008 when they saw the first hint of a run on the money markets. They basically stepped in and gave the full faith and credit of the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve to the money market. So they prevented a run, and they can do the same thing there. If it ever did get to that point, then you'd have to worry about the pivot from deflation, which I believe is front and center and will define the next couple of years, and then into inflation, where they just are tempted to print their way out of it. And these are opposing forces that are very strong. My belief is that there's simply no way to prevent the deflationary bust that's coming, and that they won't be able. There's simply there's more debt out there than their ability to print. There's actually a finite limit to what they can do on their balance sheet, and they're really at the end of that. They've actually admitted that, and they've done all they can. It's up for the government now to step in and make the hard decisions, because for the last 4 years, the Federal Reserve and the monetary chiefs around the world have been doing all the heavy lifting, and the governments have been just piling on more debt at a faster rate than ever. And we've had 4 deficits in a row of $1 trillion, and that is 3 to 4 standard deviations outside the highest levels in history, going back the curve for the whole, 250 years of our existence. So it's really scary levels now. Something will have to break in the next couple of years, because it's simply unsustainable.
Oh, yeah, absolutely unsustainable. You bet. What about, the EU? I don't see that surviving.
Well, no, they're the weakest sister of all, and they have particular problems that are much bigger challenges than we do because they have 17 different political systems to integrate, and that I think they're going to divide it into two different unions, the North and the South, and the South will be forced to go back to their home currencies and then just print their way out of their depressions, the way that Argentina did and other countries have done in the past when you have basically a bankrupt situation. So that is going to come to a head in the next year or so.
Well, Spain, what if it just did a Jubilee?
If they did what?
What if Spain did a Jubilee?
Well, the Jubilee has to come not from Spain. They're the ones in debt.
Yeah.
The Jubilee has to come from the ECB and the Fed. The institutions that control the credit, they're the ones who are the ones to appeal to. Of course, Spain would love nothing more than a Jubilee. Portugal, Greece, of course they would go for it in a minute. But it's not up to them. It's up to the ECB, the IMF, and these institutions that to the Bundesbank. These are the institutions that are going to make the call on the Jubilee.
Oh.
So I hope that they can understand. My hope is that the concept of the Jubilee will start to take hold in the coming weeks, months, and years, so that people understand how important it is and how it's a part of the natural law. But right now, everyone believes this is just a larger recession than a typical one.
Oh,
they don't. If you look at things through the lens of the Kondratieff Wave cycle, you understand that this is part of a grand super cycle. We're at the end of a 70-year credit cycle, and that you have to completely take on a different approach. Everyone now seems to think that we can print our way out of this. When we had a recession in 2001, and like other 1990, we had recessions then, and they used monetary policy effectively to bridge that gap, and it has worked. But if you look at the cycle, when you're in this tail end of a Kondratieff Winter, then this approach doesn't work. And what they should have done in 2008 is understand that, and you would have had a much different scenario, a lot of pain for a couple, 3 years, much like what happened to Ireland. Mm-hmm. But now look at Ireland. They've come out of this thing. Now they're in the best shape of any country in Europe because they took the medicine and fixed themselves, and now they can begin a new cycle of growth with a strong foundation. And that's what the tenet of the Kondratieff cycle is all about. You cannot enter a new cycle of growth of 60 years or so in a new cycle from winter to spring. That's where the cycles change. You cannot enter the spring period of glory and growth and prosperity until you rid the excesses from the previous cycle.
Yeah.
And so that is the basic theory of the seasons and how important they are. And if you look at what happened when we erased our debt in World War II and through natural growth and the fact that we had the dominant economy in the world, that's when we were able to thrive, when we had a strong foundation. And we weren't wasting resources on destruction in World War II.
Yeah.
So what we need is to first understand that we have to rid these debts one way or the other. There has to be a combination of default, bankruptcies, and jubilees, debt forgiveness. That's the way to do it.
Well, is there any penalty to debt forgiveness?
Well, yes. The penalty is that there will be winners and losers. And see, the challenge for whoever is going to be able to coordinate this, whether it be a U.S. president or the head of the IMF, the head of ECB, the Fed, whoever is going to be able to do this is going to have to be able to convince the people that are owed the money that they're not going to get it anyway. So you better just have a coordinated plan. That way everyone can begin growth again, and then you can retool this whole thing. But see, many people up until now have been very hard-headed, and they think, well, they don't want to give up anything. They don't want to give up any haircut on the debt. Mm-hmm. What they don't realize is that they're not going to get most of that back anyway. They're better off if everyone coordinates a global jubilee. Then what you'll have is businesses start to spend again. Because what's happening the last few years is that businesses are holding back hiring and spending because there's just too much uncertainty because all this debt's hanging over. If you get rid of that debt, then the losers will have to realize that they will make up a good part of what they give up by the new cycle of growth that's about to happen.
What about mortgages on homes?
Well, that's a whole other thing. You're going to have some debt forgiveness for people that are underwater. That's more of a micro issue where you're going to have a case-by-case basis. You have to create a situation where you don't have an incentive for people to default, because that's been going on left and right in the last few years. It's a very delicate balance to have to do, but you basically have a large number of people still underwater. I think the numbers are as high as 30 or 40% of American homes have more debt than they're worth.
Oh.
They have no equity. So you have to do something to remedy that. And the way one of the ways I would suggest is have the banks give debt forgiveness, and then you could have some tax incentives going out in the future to offset that. And that would be a good example of a government program that wouldn't cause any pain for the government in the short term, but it could get the economy going, and you could get people to stay in their homes, because the more times you have people changing homes, the worse it is for the neighborhoods. We've all seen what's happened in the last few years. So the goal has to be to minimize the number of people switching and leaving homes. A certain percentage of them need to be removed, because the ones who got the ninja loans really should not be in some of the homes that they bought with nothing down. But a very large amount of Americans that are underwater are underwater because they had predatory loans and the interest rates went jacked up. They're working on some of those, but there's a lot of work left to do to resolve that. That's an example of a micro form of Jubilee. That's a case-by-case basis, though, and that's going to have to be done by the individual banks and the regulators.
Well,
there is one Jubilee that I do want to suggest, though.
Okay.
Now that I want to put forth here, that is probably what I think is the landmark test case of the concept, because it's the one group of people that are the most deserving of a Jubilee, even more than the homeowners that are underwater, and that is students that have graduated with six-figure debts, that are the best and brightest of our society, are now saddled with debts. The average, I think, is over $60,000. Some have well over $100,000 in debt, and these are not able to be written off on Chapter 7 bankruptcies. And the interest rates are actually going up on these loans, and this is going to be a drag on our economy and on the development of our talent here for a long time. So I have been working on the concepts to introduce into some lawmakers what I call the Omnibus Provision of Student Relief Act of 2016, because I know it's going to take destruction in the next couple of years for people to wake up and understand that we're going to need this. But this, to me, is the ultimate form of Jubilee that has to be imposed, because these universities that charge way too much, and there's too much of a permissive environment for lending for these institutions that charge too much, and it's just an untenable situation. And I think that from a political standpoint, who would sit there and argue that this group of people don't need relief? I just don't see how you could argue against that these people don't need the relief, because this is going to hold down the economic spending in the U.S. If these people are indebted, you're going to have retail sales are going to be very poor in the coming years. It's a very big drag on retail sales and the overall economy, and consumer spending is 70% of our economy. And if you have the next generation of spenders saddled with tremendous debt that's accruing with interest every year, and now many of them cannot find a job out of college, you just have a situation that's just going to get awful and much worse before it gets better. And I think you're going to hit a point in a couple of years where it's just it's really sad. It'll be on the public consciousness to the point where this would be a perfect initial step for the Jubilee concept. And I think most would advocate that we could do that, because then certain institutions who were lending will take the spanking, and they need to take the spanking because that was egregious, and they took it on the chance. These are actually, many of them are poor credits when you consider the degrees they got and the amount of debt they got in. But the reason that these loans were made is because they could never be written off. They had to change that provision, because this goes directly against what the Scripture says about the concept of the Jubilee in the Bible, is that you cannot have a system set up that enslaves people for cycles and cycles.
Right.
And that's exactly what this does. Oh. And I intend to make this a point to get across to as many people as I can, and I think it just makes too much sense.
Oh, it makes a whole lot of sense. I know of a couple of people that borrowed $25,000, and their debt is now up to and over $100,000.
It's the single most egregious form of debt enslavement.
Yes.
And it's the single worst offender of the biblical Jubilee concept. Mm-hmm. Because of everything, you enslave them at a young age. And these things, I think some of these people will be paying off. If nothing is done, if there's no Jubilee, then you could have these debts lasting their entire lifetime.
Yeah.
And part of the solution I would advocate is that a certain percentage of them be discharged on a Chapter 11, Chapter 7, maybe 50%, maybe 70%. It doesn't have to be the entire amount, but you've got to get these balances down.
Yes, absolutely.
So, or maybe a scaled-in balance, but you cannot have these balances start off at a young age so high, and they're only going to get higher.
Yeah.
And many of them can't even begin to make the initial payments on them. So.
Right. It is horrific. What about Iceland and what they did?
Well, Iceland is like Ireland, a fantastic example. Of what they did to take care of it. They basically did the same thing Ireland did, was basically fess up and reboot. They did not print, and they didn't try to sugarcoat it and kick the can down the road. They took their lumps, and they went basically bankrupt. But they took it one step farther. They even took their president to court and had him convicted, and they had a lot of top officials convicted. And they took... although he wasn't actually jailed, they took it to a level where they brought shame to the people that did it.
Yeah.
And that's the example I would like to see for our leaders to be able to face that kind of shame, because their egos are bigger than their bank account.
Oh, yeah.
So you can get to them worse through the public shame, and even if they don't go to jail, their legacies are ruined.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think a lot of people's legacies out there need to be ruined out there.
Yes.
Even if they don't go to jail, they need to understand that they were very complicit in what happened, in enabling what happened in the last credit crunch. And then also, since what happened in 2008, there's a number of people that have been a big part of the problem that need to be outed. And I think that the entire Federal Reserve needs to be outed for the institution for what it is.
Yes.
And that's a whole other discussion there, though. That would take too long to go into tonight. But
well, we'll have another discussion. Believe me. Oh my goodness. Well, Peter, name the years where it's going to get worse.
Well, I think it begins worse beginning this fall. I just did a post last night that broke down all the reasons why I believe that the worst of the crash will begin this October. I think we could have one little run-up with this printing that's going to start tomorrow with the ECB. And then the realization will hit in October that All this printing does nothing for economic growth, and the world economy is actually going down the toilet right now.
Yeah.
And that's something that the printing just can't address. It can prop up asset prices temporarily, but at the end of the day, stocks are about profits, and the world profit picture is we're